Today at the National Press Club, Sex Discrimination Commissioner Dr. Anna Cody. As rates of domestic, family and sexual violence rise, her speech will present a vision for the future of gender equality in Australia. Sex Discrimination Commissioner Dr. Anna Cody with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's Westpac National Press Club address. My name is Emma MacDonald. I am the Associate Editor of Her Canberra and the Canberra Convener of Women in Media. Today's speaker is Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner Dr. Anna Cody. Dr. Cody was formerly a lawyer, an academic and a human rights advocate who won the Australian Human Rights Medal in 2016 for her contribution to justice. During the first two of her 5-year term, Dr. Cody has brought a focus to Indigenous women as well as to women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Her speech is entitled All Voices, Equal Futures, A Vision for Gender Equality in Australia. If you would like to join the conversation online, please use the handle at Press Club Aust, and our hashtag is NPC. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cody.
Good afternoon. It's an honour to speak at the National Press Club today, joining the voices of many who've shared their visions for change. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose lands we meet today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I particularly recognise First Nations women I've worked with over the years and learnt from, such as my colleagues Commissioner Katie Kiss, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Michelle Trudgett and Professors Noreen Young and Larissa Berendt, whose care for community, country and family has demonstrated a strong model of leadership which challenges all of us. I particularly recognise the support of my colleagues at the Australian Human Rights Commission, Commissioners Giri Sivaraman, Robert Fitzgerald and President Hugh de Kretser, the senior leadership team and the communications team. I'm also grateful to all members of my team, past and present, led by Christine Ratnasingham, and specifically for their collaboration in writing this speech, Rachel Scott and Caitlin Morahan. Thank you to my partner, my children and family for coming today, and my family at home, for their constant support of my work. Today I share my reflections 2 years into my term as Sex Discrimination Commissioner. I'll speak about the priorities guiding my work, the impact of overlapping forms of discrimination, and the inclusive, community-centred approaches we need to address gender inequality in Australia. Gender equality benefits all of us, and to achieve it, we must involve everyone. Over the last 50 years, we've made real progress in addressing gender inequality in Australia. When I reflect on some of the formative experiences in my working life, I remember the many strong and inspiring women I've worked with, clients, colleagues, leaders across civil society, government, unions, business, who've contributed to this change. One of my first jobs as a new lawyer in the 1990s was in El Salvador, which was in the middle of a war at the time. I worked with women and girls, helping them learn about their legal rights. There was no Sex Discrimination Act and limited protection for those experiencing family and domestic violence. What has stayed with me most is the strength and determination of the women I met. I remember visiting them in their one-roomed homes along the railway track and holding learning workshops in a tin shed with dirt floors. They always brought their children as they shared stories about their lives, about violence in their homes and in their country, about the challenges of unwanted pregnancies. They were determined to learn and speak out. That same strength was shown by the women leaders who ensured women were an integral part of the peace process in El Salvador. And I've seen that same determination in women here in Australia, in those who fought for the Sex Discrimination Act, paid parental leave and paid domestic and family violence leave, among many other accomplishments. Our achievements up until now and the structures of equality that we have are the result of strong advocacy by leaders and communities across the country. But we must acknowledge how far we still have to go. To achieve gender equality, we need to make sure our understanding of it includes everyone. We must listen to those with lived experience of inequality and recognise how different forms of disadvantage combine. The concept of intersectionality, rooted in the Black feminist movement, helps us understand how aspects of identity and experience, like gender, race, disability, class, age, or sexuality, combine to shape people's experience of discrimination and exclusion. It provides a strong framework for how we engage with systems issues around privilege and power. It's why older women who face both gender and age bias are at greater risk of homelessness. It's why an LGBTQI+ woman with disability may struggle to access in-home care that respects both her identity and her support needs. When we centre diverse voices and lived experience, we deepen our understanding of what gender equality truly means. It's not just about the concept of fairness, it's about building policies and laws that reflect the full spectrum of human experience. Today, I want to explore 4 key areas that I believe are central to this work: gender norms, concepts of merit, economic equality and shared care, and gendered violence. And to do this, I'm going to trace the life of Dia. Born in Australia to parents who were forced to migrate from their home in Bangladesh, Dia grew up in Western Sydney with her parents, grandmother, and twin brother. Before we begin Dia's story, it's important to understand the gender norms that shape her and her brother's lives from the start. These norms reflect society's expectations about how women and men should behave, express themselves, and take on roles within families and the wider community. For Dia and her brother, these norms start the day they are born. People describe Dia as sweet and pretty. As for her brother, they say he'll be brave and strong. As a child, Dia is encouraged to nurture, praised for helping her teacher and comforting classmates. Meanwhile, her brother is taught to take charge in group activities and to hide his emotions, especially when he's hurt or sad. It's these stereotypes that quietly influence their choices, confidence, and opportunities. They dictate who speaks up in the classroom, who leads in the workplace, and who's believed when they speak out. What begins small can grow into powerful, limiting norms that children will carry with them into adulthood. When I think about my experiences parenting a daughter and a son, I'm reminded how easily stereotypes can creep in, even with the best intentions. I try to encourage both my children in their sport, their academic and creative interests, and make space for each of them to talk about their worries, not just their achievements. As children, making sure to teach them both to cook and showing them that care and contribution at home is all of our work. It's through our daily ways of being with each other that we challenge the everyday assumptions that lead to gender inequality. And we can only do this when we involve boys and men in the conversations. In March, the Netflix show Adolescents had Australia talking. At home, among families and in classrooms, it started conversations on how negative attitudes and beliefs around gender can be absorbed online and in real life. The show didn't only start conversations, it made history. Last week, Adolescents won 8 Emmy Awards. And these wins show that when we tell honest stories about gender, power, and respect, people listen. The show has encouraged young people to question the messages around gender norms, norms that they've grown up with and consumed online. And we need to keep questioning them, because real change starts when we're given the tools to reflect, unlearn, and lead differently. Strict ideas of masculinity and femininity limit opportunities for everyone. They shape how we think we're expected to behave, what roles we're allowed to take on, and how freely we can express who we are. For example, AFL is one of Australia's most celebrated sports, and yet in the men's game, only one player has come out as gay or bisexual in 129 years. And that was after retirement. Why? Because the type of masculinity celebrated in sport still sends the message that you must be tough, stoic, and straight, and there's little room to be a different type of man. Dia sees this playing Oztag with her brother. When she falls over, she's comforted and taken to the sideline to rest. When it happens to her brother, he's encouraged to get up, brush it off, and keep playing. If we want a culture of safety and respect, we need to invest in comprehensive and inclusive relationships and consent education from early childhood, so our children grow up learning empathy, emotional awareness, and respect. This teaches Dia and her male peers to challenge stereotypes, understand mutual respect, and learn how to communicate about consent. It empowers all young people, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation, to break free of those gender norms and feel free to be exactly who they are. When we talk about gender equality, we must be clear that means equal treatment of all genders, including trans and non-binary people. Around the world, we're seeing gender diversity being used as a weapon for ideological and political purposes. This is particularly unjust when it targets a group that already faces higher rates of violence and makes up less than 1% of the population. When we affirm and support a person's identity, we reduce the risk of them being treated unfairly in everyday situations like walking down the street, applying for jobs, going to the doctor, or travelling. We reject the stigma that says trans people must hide who they are to be safe or accepted. When we recognise trans rights, we recognise the worth and dignity of every person. We need urgent and coordinated action from all levels of government, state, territory, and federal. That includes ongoing funding for consistent and inclusive education that's based on evidence, covering relationships, consent, and sexual and reproductive health. I'm now going to turn to concepts of merit. As Dia grows older, she becomes a disability care worker, but her journey into the workforce reveals another layer of inequality. Like many Australians, Dia works in a highly gender-segregated occupation that has long been undervalued and underpaid. These structural inequalities contribute directly to the gender pay gap. According to the latest data from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, women earn 78 cents to the dollar of every man. And that gap is even wider for First Nations women, who earn 65 cents to every dollar earned by men. And despite progress, women also remain underrepresented in leadership positions across most industries. A recent report by Jobs and Skills Australia found that only 1 in 5 workers work in occupations where there are roughly equal numbers of men and women. First Nations workers are more likely to work in highly gender-segregated jobs, often in labouring, health and education. Culturally and racially marginalised workers are overrepresented in hospitality, driving, IT, and in the low-paid health and care sectors. And all of this impacts the gender pay gap. And it's important to look at this data from different angles to understand how the gender pay gap affects people in different communities. After 5 years as a care worker, Dia applies for a promotion. But another barrier that impacts her work opportunities is the concept of merit and how it's applied. We often hear of people getting jobs based on merit, a concept introduced to counter nepotism and patronage. Today, it's often understood as giving opportunities to the best person for the job. Psychological research reveals that merit-based evaluations are prone to bias, particularly racial and gender bias, and advantages those who fit traditional stereotypes of a professional. It means that people tend to see merit in those who are like them. Jobs and Skills Australia found that negotiation is often seen as a masculine skill linked to executives and leaders. Yet when age and disability support workers, many of whom are culturally and racially marginalised women and First Nations people, when they use negotiation skills daily to meet their clients, for example, with dementia, it's not recognised in the same way. The undervaluation of these skills is gendered, and it's one reason why female-dominated jobs have historically been underpaid. When Dia doesn't get the promotion, she's told she's not the right fit for the role. It's not because she lacks the skill and experience, but because she doesn't fit the narrow image of what merit is supposed to look like. Her brightly coloured clothes and jingling bangles are seen as different, and her quiet manner is mistaken for a lack of authority, especially when compared to the louder men around her. These men are often more likely to be seen as being meritorious and get promoted. And when they're eventually in leadership positions, they're more likely to offer job opportunities to those who look, think, and act like them. This is how bias hides behind the language of merit, and how talented individuals like Dia are overlooked, not just for promotions, but recognition and value. When we look at it through a systems lens, we can see how certain groups are excluded. And to address this, we must rethink what we mean by merit. It could mean measuring merit based on a person's potential for future growth, rather than past accomplishments. Or it could mean placing value in collective contributions as a team or organisation rather than an individual. We must critique the ideas of merit, which reinforce the status quo and instead broaden our understanding of how leadership and collaboration must centre a diversity of skills, experience, and qualifications. The challenge is clear: to expand our concept of merit to reflect the full diversity of talent in our communities. When we do this, it enables us to value the full range of contributions people make, not just in the workplace, but also at home. A few years later, Dia and her partner decide to try and have a child. And the changes in Australian law around parental leave provide an opportunity for Dia and her partner to share the care of any children that they may have. But there are still barriers to accessing these entitlements. When the baby is born, Dia is the one to take parental leave. When her partner asked his manager about taking longer than 2 weeks off, he was told, "It's a busy time of the year, and isn't your partner going to look after the baby?" In many homes, relationships may be equal until a child arrives. It's often the time when traditional gender roles quietly take over. Suddenly, for most families, it makes more sense for the woman to step back from work and take on most of the care work, while the man stays in his role as the primary earner. This shift doesn't just affect careers, it can reshape relationships. To create an Australia that sees caregiving as a shared responsibility, we must move away from rigid ideas that men are the breadwinners and women are the caregivers. We must change the narrative that taking parental leave is only for one parent. It's time to recognise that being both a worker and a carer at the same time is the reality for most of us. I'm one of 4 children, and both of my parents worked full-time, So caring for us children and the household was work that needed to be shared. I remember my father taking me supermarket shopping with him every Saturday morning. We'd chat away, my hand in his, as we chose the groceries for the week. This nurtured the strong relationship I had with him and normalised the model of caring coming from both parents. Sharing unpaid care work can help shape long-lasting patterns and perceptions within a family that nurturing emotional support and domestic responsibilities are not gendered traits, they're human ones. Changing these patterns means more than offering parental leave. It means having workplace policies that enable both parents to look after a child, providing adequate pay during leave, and earmarking leave specifically for each parent, making it the default, not the exception. When leave is automatically available and parents have to opt out rather than opt in, it sends a strong message that caregiving is valued, expected, and supported. Another barrier to women's economic equality is their experience of workplace sexual harassment. When Dia returns to work after parental leave, she's reporting to a new manager who starts making extra effort to talk to her, stares when she walks past him, tells her how beautiful her brown skin is. Dia tries to ignore him, but one day he pushes his body into hers when they're alone in a lift. She's shaken, but not totally sure that what happened would count as sexual harassment. When Dia speaks to Human Resources about her manager's behaviour, she's given a 50-page workplace sexual harassment policy to read. And the policy tells her that if she takes it further, she'll have to give detailed evidence of what happened. Dia decides to go ahead because she doesn't want what happened to her to happen to anyone else. But when she makes a formal complaint, her experience is framed as a misunderstanding. She's pressured into signing a non-disclosure agreement. The NDA silences Dia, not just legally, but emotionally. She can't warn others, seek justice, or even explain to her friends why she decided to leave her job. Sexual harassment in the workplace shows how power is misused. For many years, I worked as a lawyer in a community legal centre, helping women who had been sexually harassed. I saw how discrimination law could help, but also where it fell short, because it put so much responsibility on the woman. We can be proud that our laws now have a positive duty on workplaces, an obligation to prevent sexual harassment and sex discrimination before it occurs. This is a vital shift away from placing the burden on victim survivors to report and moves towards a culture of prevention. Despite this, there's still a long way to go. We know from the 5th National Survey on Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces that 1 in 3 women experience workplace sexual harassment. For First Nations women, women with disabilities, LGBTQI+ people, and women from culturally and racially marginalised backgrounds, it's 1 in 2 women. Recognising this, my team and I spent 6 months in consultations across Australia as part of our Speaking from Experience project, hearing from over 300 people who'd experienced workplace sexual harassment. We focused on diverse experiences so we could better understand how multiple forms of discrimination like racism, homophobia, ableism and ageism can intersect with gender discrimination to shape a person's experience of sexual harassment. Dia's story is not unique. NDAs undermine the transparency that's essential for genuine accountability. Contributors to the project consistently noted that NDAs and confidentiality agreements perpetuate a culture of silence. They prevent us from identifying and addressing the drivers and barriers of workplace sexual harassment, especially when the victim survivor is already facing systemic barriers like racism, visa insecurity, and cultural stigma. One of the major achievements of the Me Too movement was the sense of power and collective voice which women gained through speaking out. NDAs stifle this. That's why our report calls for an overhaul to the use of NDAs in workplace sexual harassment cases, banning them except when they're requested by a victim survivor who's also had access to legal advice. Dia's experience shows us how her cultural background and her gender influence her experience of sexual harassment. If we're to create effective and long-standing change to properly prevent and respond to gendered violence, we need to incorporate these kinds of experiences into our workplace responses. We need education that reaches the grassroots, delivered in partnership with community groups who work with those most at risk. We also need to know the true scale of the problem, which is why we need a national prevalence survey in 2026. Finally, I want to talk about domestic and family violence. Since the day I started as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner, 136 women have been killed in this country because of gendered violence. These numbers are real women, living their ordinary lives, killed. 2 in 5 women have experienced intimate partner violence since the age of 15, and 1 in 5 have experienced sexual violence. We cannot accept this, and we must do better. But there is no one solution to this. Domestic and family violence is about the use of power and control over another in a relationship, driven by the gender and social expectations that create inequality. But violence doesn't just persist because of individuals. It's also enabled by systemic failures. For example, victim survivors are failed by the system when they call the police and not believed or taken seriously, or when they can't access safe housing or financial support. These gaps in our systems allow violence to continue. Diverse women face even more risks when it comes to gendered violence. First Nations and culturally, racially marginalised women are more likely to be misidentified as the perpetrator of violence because of cultural misunderstandings, language barriers and disbelief, or behaviour which doesn't fit the expected image of a victim survivor. Perhaps she argues with police and shows anger instead of tears. This can lead to devastating consequences like lack of safety, criminalisation, child removal and re-traumatisation. For women with disability, often it can be their carer on whom they rely daily for support who's violent. The abuse of older women by family members is rising at alarming rates, yet remains one of the most hidden and underreported forms of violence in Australia. These women do not just have one experience. Their experiences are shaped by factors such as race, faith, sexuality, gender identity and settlement stage. And government responses need to reflect these complexities so they can properly support safety and recovery. For example, First Nations women must be at the centre of reforms for their communities. Some years ago, I worked in Alice Springs establishing a domestic and family violence service. To create an effective service, I worked with local Aboriginal women's groups to shape the appropriate response within each community and for each woman. For some, that response may be time in a refuge. For others, an apprehended violence order. Or for the man using violence, time in a culturally appropriate, trauma-informed alcohol use program. We've seen that community-led justice reinvestment is an effective tool to address gender-based violence. Justice reinvestment addresses the underlying causes of crime and aims to stop it from occurring in the first place. It's a crucial shift away from governments coming in and telling communities what they think is best and moves towards what we know does work, handing over decision-making power and supporting solutions created by and for communities. In Bourke, New South Wales, the Marangooka Justice Reinvestment Project developed an approach to family violence where support was provided to both the perpetrator and the victim in each incident. A men's shed was built to give men somewhere they could go to cool down, positively connect with other men, positively connect for support and take part in meaningful activities. This combined shared power model reduced family violence by a third. Responses to gendered violence cannot be built on a single story. They must be shaped by the voices of First Nations women and informed by the lived experiences of culturally and racially marginalised people, women with disability and LGBTQI+ communities. So today, I call on all of us, families, policymakers, government bodies, businesses, unions, community leaders, to move beyond words and into action, to create an Australia where women like Dia don't have to face so many barriers to equality. I call on all levels of government, federal, state and territory, to ensure that women in all our diversity are not only heard, but are central to informing the policies that shape our lives. Let's recognise that gender equality benefits everyone and challenge the outdated gender norms that limit all of us. We can build a culture where care is shared and everyone's potential is recognised. I call on our workplaces to redefine merit so it reflects the true breadth of Australia's diverse capabilities and confront how our current systems of recognition are shaped by gender and race. I call upon all of us to commit to ending gendered violence with a unified, community-led approach, one that prioritises prevention, accountability and safety. And let's run a national prevalence survey in 2026 so we can fully understand the impact of workplace sexual harassment and continue to work towards effective solutions. We are stronger, smarter and more compassionate when every person is empowered to be who we are and given the opportunities to participate and thrive. Let's be courageous in our efforts. Be bold and try something, even if it seems small. Let's centre equality in our lives, because when we do, we don't just change our society for the better, we change ourselves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cody. I thought I would ask you to perhaps elaborate on NDAs. Do we have any idea of their prevalence? How many get signed each year? Who are they protecting? And how would we actually go about eliminating them? And has anyone else gone down this route?
There isn't a central register for non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements, but from some research that was done by lawyers from Redfern Legal Centre and Human Rights Law Centre, we know that they are prevalent, that the majority of discrimination complaints are resolved with a confidentiality agreement on NDA. And we also know that it is almost assumed by many employers that it's required, that it's a part of their template, their resolution template, settlement template. So there is a lot of work for us to do in this area. to try and stop that practice. We have guidelines that the Respect at Work Council developed that we use, for example, at the Australian Human Rights Commission, which do not, unless the victim survivor wants a confidentiality agreement, and some may, then we would recommend that they should not be used.
I would imagine there might be some reluctance to let them go.
Well, I would say that the best employers, best workplaces, recognise that they have that duty, the positive duty, which is to prevent, eliminate forms of workplace sexual harassment and sex discrimination. And a part of that is actually making their workplaces accountable and transparent. So it's one of our guidelines. So my argument would be that it's actually the best employers who, as a part of that accountability and transparency, would welcome not using the NDAs.
Alrighty. Next question is Shalila Medora from the ABC.
Thank you so much for your speech. Shalila Medora from Triple J and Women in Media. I want to take you to your last point about domestic, family and sexual violence. It felt like a few years ago that we'd reached a point of critical mass on this issue. Thousands were marching in the streets. It was daily headline-making news. We had actual practical conversations in Parliament that led to changes in that workplace and others. But since then, as you yourself pointed out, 136 women have died in the last 2 years. It's no longer making headlines. The conversation in politics has died off. In fact, it barely rated a mention in May's federal election. So I wanted to ask you why you think that has happened and what all levels of government can do to bring it back into the headlines.
I think that levels of government are different. So certainly within some parts of government, that focus has not shifted. The rapid response certainly looked at the experience of domestic and family violence and came up with some really practical responses. The Commissioner for Domestic and Family Violence, Michaela Cronin, who's here, has also been at the forefront of coming up with responses to domestic and family violence. Sadly, because it's so pervasive almost, I think people become inured to talking about it, which is why it's so important to think about each of those lives lost. When we suddenly have a focus on a particular woman, we recognise her children, her sisters, her brother, her mother, and recognise that she's a person who has also died. But it's hard to keep that humanity in the focus. We know that the media cycle is also short and quick. It will focus on many of the challenges that we have. There are many things happening in the world today which grab our attention. So I don't think that there is a lack of attention within states and territories or at a federal level. I know that the Minister for Women is very concerned about the experience of domestic and family violence. But it's about recognising what can make a difference. And it would be nice if there was one solution, but there isn't. It has to be a shaped solution to each community and shaped by that community. It cannot be imposed. Otherwise, it just does not work.
Next question is Ellie Campbell from the Canberra Times.
Thank you for your speech, Dr. Cody. Can I please ask you about NDAs? Current government policy states that NDAs should not be used. However, this is not enshrined in law. I wanted to ask you, what precedent do you think that this sets for the private sector, and what more do you think needs to be done in this space?
Thank you. So, as I mentioned in the speech about our Speaking from Experience project, where we heard from over 300 people about their experience, including their experience of NDAs, and we heard loud and clear that they were experienced as silencing, and it was that impact of both not being able to talk to their psychologist sometimes, not being able to share with their colleagues why they were leaving the job. So they have a really deep and harmful impact. What we recommended as a part of the Speaking from Experience project was that we should pass within law an amendment so that NDAs could not be used except where they were initiated by victim survivors. So there are some limited occasions where a victim survivor wants that confidentiality, where, for example, they work in a small business or in a community where it might be recognised. So there are some situations where they're appropriate for their use. We also know that internationally there has been precedent in Ireland, in the UK, that there has been legislation which actually outlaws the use of NDAs. So certainly there's room for both within government and within the private sector for the legislation to catch both of them as employers.
Next question is
The West Australian, thank you. Thank you for your address today. When it comes to high-profile women in leadership positions who make headlines in Australia, they're often scrutinised for their appearance and their body language. We saw it with Julia Gillard. We've seen it recently with Julie Bishop regarding the ANU saga. There's been recent coverage that's commented on her expensive shoes, death stare, fidgeting under pressure. How persuasive do you think this issue is in Australia, and what role does the media have in addressing it? And more broadly, do you think that Australia has a problem with successful women in leadership positions?
Well, I guess that's me too, isn't it? I think that there is absolutely scrutiny on women for how they look, how they dress, their makeup, their size. You know, when we think about in our daily lives, the number of comments that women receive on their appearance, it's in our daily lives. And then when it's elevated to women in leadership, then it's absolutely that women are under scrutiny for how they look. And I would absolutely agree in terms of the amount of attention that both the Chancellor, Julie Bishop, but also the Vice-Chancellor, Genevieve Bell, received for the clothing that they wear. Was not provided to, for example, Andrew Parfitt, who's the Vice-Chancellor at UTS, who was also going through issues of cutting staff. So if you look at the same issue and then how it gets dealt with within the media, there is an additional level of scrutiny, and it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant what someone wears, whether they fidget under the spotlight or whether they are wearing makeup or what their size is. That's not a requirement for good leadership. And I would absolutely request that media should stop asking questions about, or commenting or including in their articles, questions about a woman's appearance, her size, her shape.
Beyond the media, do you think that there's roles institutions can play in shielding female leaders from this scrutiny?
Absolutely. As part of an employment relationship, all employers have a responsibility to keep their workers safe. And so as a part of that, that psychosocial safety, as we know from workplace sexual harassment, includes keeping them safe from unwarranted attacks and making sure that there are measures in place so that all people are safe, including women.
Thank you.
next question is Ginger Gorman from IPA.
Thank you very much for your address, Dr. Cody. Got a short person problem here. Thank you so much for putting so much diversity into your talk and also highlighting so many experiences that many women in this room, including myself, recognise. I'm a journalist, but I'm also working for IPA, and we are focusing on the quality of the public service and the capability of the public service. In the APS, so many women are in lower level positions, and then they're very underrepresented in higher level positions. And this is the case in so many industries, and it seems like an intractable problem. What's the solution?
I mean, what you're touching on is what creates the gender pay gap, which the Workplace Gender Equality Agency and Mary Wooldridge have done fantastic work around. So part of the solution is continuing the reporting that we have, and we now have an extension of that so that all employers, private and will soon be public employers, so including the public service, will also report on their compliance with 3 gender equality indicators that they have chosen. So that transparency, that shining a light on what are workplaces, employers doing to, for example, deal with workplace sexual harassment, which we know is a real stifler for women's advancement and economic equality, but also ensuring that women's skills are recognised. And that was one of the key things that came out in the Jobs and Skills Australia report, was looking at how particular industries there is that dominance of women, and where more occupations are gender segregated, then there's a higher gap between men's and women's earnings. So what we need to do is keep that transparency, make sure that we have that reporting. We've also called for some of that breadth, diversity of reporting within the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, so that it includes First Nations status as well as culturally and racially marginalised status. So it's important for us to have a really clear picture, so then we can start to address it. And I think that a part of it is around recognising those ideas of merit, recognising that who is it who gets recognised for what they're contributing. And those ideas that I mentioned in my speech about future potential, and also recognising how our workplace is made up of a whole group of skills and capabilities. So looking at the overarching group of skills and capabilities that all our modern workplaces need, and ensuring that they are encouraged and enabled to participate.
Thank you.
Dr. Cody, you spoke about initiatives like the opt-out rather than opt-in parental leave. How do we better recognise and support the untold hours of unpaid care given by Australian women? In particular, I think in this room you'll find a lot of women who would identify as being part of the sandwich generation, that is those who are caring for older kids and starting to care for aged parents, and it's apparently going to get quite tricky to manage. So any suggestions?
I think that idea that I mentioned in the speech about recognising that we are all workers and carers, that we're not just that one identity. So making sure, and I think that's been one of the absolute benefits of COVID, is recognising that we can shape work and our caring responsibilities in flexible ways, that enables us to have that identity of being both carer and worker. And it is breaking down some of those norms so that care is shared within a family, so that it doesn't just fall, as it currently does, mostly on women to carry that responsibility. So it is about having flexible work responsibilities, having, for example, as one of the gender equality indicators, whether an employer is encouraging men to take up parental leave, whether or not an employer is ensuring that they have flexible work conditions available. I think that's the broader structure within which we can shift how we think about care. Actually, I mean, there have in the past been calls for pay for that care work. I don't think that's likely to be achieved. So I would probably go with those other measures.
All right, next question is Steve Lewis from the National Press Club.
Thank you, Dr. Cody. Steve Lewis, Director of the National Press Club. You referenced adolescence in your speech, which was extraordinary 4 hours, tour de force, dealt with a really uncomfortable issues, cyberbullying. In Australia, we of course have a social media ban which comes into effect, I think, later this year. People under 16 years of age will be prevented from accessing a whole raft of social media. UNICEF Australia, I was just reading their website, they say that the proposed changes won't fix the problems young people face online. So I'd like you to just talk about this. Do you think the social media ban introduced by the Albanese government will have any impact on cyberbullying, on young people, particularly young women, being cyberbullied by other women or by men? Or do you think, like UNICEF Australia, it won't actually address or fix some of those problems that adolescents raised?
It's a really complex area, the regulation of social media and the way in which it is now an intrinsic part of all of our lives, but particularly for young people, that they live their lives online as much as in real life. So while UNICEF absolutely says it's not going to fix it, and no one solution will fix it, it is one measure to try and postpone or delay the harmful impacts of social media, online bullying, and some of the influence that some of the algorithms will push onto girls and boys when they're under 16. We know that the social media companies use algorithms and recommender systems that specifically will target boys with really harmful ideas around masculinity, rather than the many ways in which there are to be a healthy, participating young man or boy. So it stops some of that harm from happening quite so young, And it also stops the use, as we know, of the use of apps which can create, with AI, deep fakes, horrible images that are really harmful to both boys and girls. So it's absolutely a step to delay. It doesn't solve it. And I think that the E-Safety Commissioner has a really good approach in terms of focusing on what can those tech companies do. We know how many resources they have behind them, and also the way in which they create the algorithms which push that harmful material.
Are there further measures that should be taken to address cyberbullying, particularly gender cyberbullying, which is what adolescence was essentially about?
I don't think adolescence was just about cyberbullying. I think it was also about the family relationship and the understanding of norms within that family. But cyberbullying, it is the social media changes is a way, as I said, to postpone. So I don't think it will stop it once a child turns 16, then they will have access to that. And I note they'll still have access to communicate with their friends on some platforms. So it's not stopping the positive part of being available online.
Next question is Mabeni Sondaluka from the Black Cover.
Thank you for your speech, Dr. Cody. Mabengi Sondaluka from the Back Cover. Given First Nations women, migrant women and women of colour are disproportionately affected by sexual harassment, what does meaningful intersectionality look like for government and for employers?
A part of it is understanding how sexual harassment happens. We still have a fairly limited, narrow understanding of sexual harassment, even though we've been talking about it for many years. So one of the things that came out of the Speaking from Experience project was recognising the way power is used by harassers within a workplace. So that recognising, as the story of Dia showed, both her gender and her race were a part of the sexual harassment. It wasn't that they were separate, in the same way that disability and sex can be used. So comments such as, are you, for someone who has a psychosocial disability, are you sure it happened that way? Were you really feeling well that day? So there's ways in which the sexual harassment combines with that person's identity and is a part of that person's experience. And then also the way it impacts on them. So if you're on a temporary visa or if you're in casual employment as a young person, then it has more of an impact on you because you rely on that employment. If you've already faced racism trying to get that job to start with, then you're less likely to leave it. So therefore your ability to speak out and take any action is reduced. So I think part of it is understanding the full extent and the way in which sexual harassment happens and that power that gets used by harassers within a workplace. So it's understanding, amplifying, thinking more deeply about sexual harassment, and then thinking about the responses that we need to make. And the positive duty is so that positive duty to prevent workplace sexual harassment is a great change in our law. It really does put the burden on that responsibility on employers, and we know that the good employers want to do the right thing. No one wants workplace sexual harassment to be happening. So it's providing them with that opportunity to really pick that up and take action.
Thank you.
Next question is Corey McLeod, another National Press Club Director.
Thank you, Dr. Cody. Corey McLeod, also innovationals.com. Thank you for your address. Lots of really interesting insights about gender norms and families and stereotypes. I was wondering if you had thoughts about the trad wife movement. Is this like a social media role playing, or is it symptomatic of something a little bit more difficult that we need to be looking at? Because it seems as though it's gaining momentum.
So there is definitely a range of ways in which women will express themselves. And so for some, they will find great fulfilment in being a mother, being at home, looking after a home and looking after their family. So for some, absolutely, they need to be respected and absolutely, enabled to do that. But for the majority of women, that's not the reality of how we live our lives. As I said, most of us are doing caring and working outside the home, and that's both gives us a sense of contribution to our community, to our society, but also a sense of worth and a sense of value, while we're also doing our caring responsibilities. Whether it's growing, I have a sense that there is certainly more discussion about it, but that probably also picks up on some of the more conservative aspects that have also been growing internationally over the last year probably. There's certainly a focus on it. Whether or not it's actually a movement, you know, I'm not sure how widespread that movement is, but certainly there's a focus on it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to carry on from that excellent question, you've lived and worked in America. What do you make of the Trump presidency in terms of the rollback of reproductive rights, the impending look at whether married women will be able to vote, a war on DEI? What is going to be the long-term impact on this for all of us?
It is deeply concerning, and when we think of the power that the United States holds within the international order, certainly within the United Nations, but also internationally, the language, the actions that have been taken around reproductive rights, the impact that has on women who are seeking a termination, having to go and travel or not being able to access that reproductive health service. So it is deeply concerning. The way in which I see it happening in Australia is that in some ways it provides a contrast, because we can see the harm that that creates to everyday people who want to live their lives, who want to be able to access the health services they need, who want to be able to go to school, who want to be able to work safely, and yet they're being stopped from doing that. So certainly I think it provides a contrast in terms of we don't want that same system to take place within Australia. And I think that it is also, I mean, internationally it's provided a inspiration or impetus for other countries to recognise what we do well. What is it? What are the structures that we have that enable equality? And we have some really great structures, some of which I've talked about in the speech and in my questions, that stop some of those things from taking root within Australia.
Okay, next question is Megan Poore from the Women's Advocate.
Megan Poore, the Women's Advocate. Commissioner, you have powers under Section 11 of the AHRC Act to inquire into acts or practices inconsistent with human rights. Women's advocacy groups report systematic exclusion from consultation on sex and gender policy. Will you use your powers to investigate whether this meets CEDAW Article 7's requirement for meaningful participation across government agencies, including the Commission itself?
Consultation and listening to women who have actually experienced any type of discrimination or violence is fundamental to the way we work at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and it was a fundamental part of the Speaking from Experience project, and any project that I lead will absolutely centre the voices of women who have experienced discrimination. It is part of human rights is to have meaningful participation in decisions that affect you on a daily basis. And across government, I am conscious, certainly within the areas that I deal with, that there is consultation and participation, particularly consultation with First Nations women, with culturally, racially marginalised women, women with disability, about the policies that impact them. I'm sure that could be improved. It always can be, but there is definitely a commitment, and I have seen that happening in the development of policies that I've seen develop.
The question specifically about women's rights organisations working for sex-based protections and rights. It's about the women that CEDAW was designed to protect and who remain central to CEDAW regardless of any retrospective interpretations. I was wondering about women in those organisations.
So CEDAW has been interpreted and understood to include all women, if that's what you're getting at. That certainly the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, so CEDAW, is absolutely, it's the Women's Convention. But in understanding, as we have developed, it was signed back in 1979, I believe. Since it's been in force in Australia, it has also been interpreted by the committee that looks at the meaning and the understanding of each of the articles of the Convention. So that includes, and it is specifically said, it includes culturally, racially marginalised women, it includes lesbians, it includes First Nations women, women with disability and trans women. So it absolutely includes all women because that is who women are. We're not one version of woman. And so that's why it has to be an inclusive definition of women.
Thank you.
Next question is Elise Searson Prakash from Lady News.
Hi, Dr. Cody, Elise from Lady News. The greatest blind spot in our conversation on gender inequality is the family court and our justice system. Everyday victim survivors of family and sexual violence, mostly mothers, lose custody of their children. Not because they're unsafe, but because the system discriminates in most cases and favours the word of men. We've even heard of a young girl abused by her father who tried to run away only for police and paramedics to suggest she be medicated and sent back to her father while her mother was restrained. Dr. Cody, as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, how do we address systemic gender inequality in institutions like the family court and the justice system, where decisions can have life and death consequences for women and children? And how do we have this conversation without offending men and creating even more division between genders?
We know that all our legal system, our laws have been traditionally shaped by men for men, and so there has been a movement to try and rethink how our laws are shaped and ensure that women's perspectives are taken into account when creating our laws. So recently there was a review of the Family Law Act which changed some of the ways in which the majority of care or responsibility was given within a relationship between, say, a man and a woman, a father and a mother. And rather than domestic and family violence being a secondary consideration, it is now a primary consideration and the risk of violence to the child. So I would say that the review of the Family Law Act to change some of the understandings around shared care, that demonstrates that women's interests are at the forefront when looking at the law and how law is shaped. Obviously, the law has to be interpreted by judges, but generally the Family Law Court they are very educated around issues of gender because it plays out within those court cases. Most judges would receive training around domestic and family violence in particular, and certainly the Chief Justice is very conscious of that. So there is an awareness of the importance of gender norms within that decision making. There may well be decisions which are unfair, but the way in which the structure has been created and the law has been created has taken into account the experience of the previous version of the Family Law Act.
If the reforms in practice are not working in the way that they set out to work, how do we, hold the family court to account for that?
So the way that we hold all governments to account and the way we hold laws and unfair laws to account, we raise it with our local members. We unite, create coalitions with other people who have had unfair responses. We create campaigns within civil society as well as raising it with government directly, with the Minister who's responsible, with the Attorney General, with whoever is actually responsible for that overarching piece of policy or law.
Thank you.
I think we'll fit one last question in from Nicole Aberdeen from Harper's Bazaar. Thank you.
Dr. Cody, thank you so much for your address, which was wonderful and a fantastic call to action for all of us. There's been a report this week, or an op-ed piece in the New York Times by Hillary Clinton, in which she refers to a report by the Institute of Global Politics, which very sadly reports that there has been a backlash throughout the world, not just in America, a backlash throughout the world in relation to women's rights, and a rollback of measures designed to for equality, gender equality. What I'm wondering is, have you seen such a backlash or rollback here?
There is. I don't see the backlash to the same degree that I think it is happening in other countries, and particularly the United States. There is certainly a greater sensitivity around talking about women's equality and gender issues within Australia, but there's also a sense of pride about what we have achieved and the way that we can show some of the success measures to the rest of the world. Certainly when I go to the Commission on the Status of Women, it has been it's been a great story to tell about some of the institutions like the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, like the Commission on Domestic Family Violence, that really structure in gender equality at the centre of decision making, the use of gender budgeting. So yes, there is a push back. I think there's a greater, I mean, I think I see it around racism as well. There's almost a greater permission to question. That's where I would see it most currently, rather than any actual change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We are going to conclude today's speech. Thank you, Dr. Cody. 3 more years of hard work to go. And here is a National Press Club membership for you to come back and have a lunch or a dinner. Thank you.